Well, Happy New Year. It's that time of year, right between Christmas and New Year's, and time to start thinking about New Year's resolution if you're into making those. One friend of mine said this week, New Year's resolution, I made a resolution when I was in college, never to make another resolution again. Yet it's very biblical to reflect on the past year. Again and again, we see throughout the Old Testament, remember what God has done for your nation and for your forefathers. Remember, reflect on it. Reflect on all the works that God has done. And so we reflect and we look back at the past year, 2024, and what it brought for you and for us. And also looking ahead toward 2025 and what you want it to be. Now, sometimes we get easily jaded with it and give up, but it's always good. It's always a good holiday to be reminded to do a little bit of life planning, do a bit of reflection, whether you're into it or not. As I said, we could get jaded, skeptical. I know every year I like going to the gym, but every January it gets unbearably crowded for about the first 3 weeks. And every year it's the same thing. By about week 3, week 4, they've all given up because it's back to the normal size crowd again. Now I picked Hebrews 12 this morning, which is a popular New Year's passage at the first few verses, but then this morning we're going to keep going with the whole chapter. Therefore, Hebrews 12 verse 1, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Whenever you see therefore in the Bible, therefore what? And as we kicked off Advent, we did the first part of Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is often referred to as the Hall of Faith. And Hebrews is a book written to the Hebrews, explaining the messiahship of Jesus and how he's become a high priest for us. And when we get to chapter 11, it highlights many of the heroes of the faith from the Old Testament, telling about the things they did and all of them with how they had faith that pleases God. And in explaining their faith, it says, hey, not all of them received all their promises in this life because they were looking forward to eternity with God. They were looking forward to a heavenly kingdom. Even though they didn't receive all the fullness of God's promises in this life, they knew they were going to, and there was no denying that. It's saying, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all of the Old Testament heroes and saints surrounding us, giving us a witness, urging us as well to live lives of faith, as they're there for examples for us to try to emulate and be people of faith just like they were. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, all the believers that have gone before us, and we could put it into our lifetime as well, we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. You know, all of us that have been in church a while, there are people that are here at this church that are no longer with us, that have lived it as an example and poured into us, or some of us go back a lot of years. Those of us that were raised in the church or have been in the church a very long time, there are people that taught us as children, people that poured into our lives, that are part of our personal cloud of witnesses that surround us, that modeled lives of faith, people we want to emulate, former pastors and Sunday school teachers and small group leaders and Vacation Bible School workers, all those people that are a cloud of witnesses for us, giving us an example of how we ought to live. Since we're surrounded by all these witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. So this is saying, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us. Not saying we need to in our lives, in order to live a life of faith, get rid of obstacles. And it uses a running analogy for getting rid of obstacles. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin. So we have obstacles in our lives that aren't sin, that sometimes need to get pushed out of the way. And there's always sin that entangles us and gets us caught up. And then it uses a running analogy. Anybody here runners or used to be runners? Yeah. Okay, there's a few of you. What do you put on when you go running? I'm a runner. I like running. I like signing up for races, although I haven't done any lately. Signing up for a race is great because it gives you motivation to train, so you don't feel like you're gonna die at the race. Especially the longer ones or shorter ones you use to just try to always be getting a better time than your last time. As I've enjoyed signing up for 5Ks, which is 3.1 miles, the 10K, 6.2 miles, or the half marathon, which is 13.1 miles. And I've not done a full marathon yet, but hopefully I'll get to that one of these days. And Mary does them with me. It had turned into sort of a date that we do and something that we'd enjoy. We both kind of gravitated after a while toward doing trail races, which are through the woods and often have a lot of elevation with them, and you end up hiking some of it as well as running. But let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance. So, taking off the things which hinder you, what do you wear to a race? Well, not much. You certainly don't put on your heavy clothes, and you don't bring things with you other than maybe a water bottle or the little water backpacks are great for the longer races. But other than that, if you're going for a run, you usually don't bring the heavy stuff. You take it off. You take the bare minimum with you. So that's saying take off all the obstacles. And what is the race it's talking about? Well, the race of life. The Apostle Paul talks elsewhere about finishing the race. And that is prayer, and I think it's the prayer of every believer that we finish well as we get closer and closer each year to that finish line. And so what does it mean in our lives to get rid of every obstacle, everything that hinders us, and the sin that so easily entangles us? Well, it's a good chance this morning to take a look at our lives. Our lives are the race. What's weighing you down? What's getting in the way from fully living God's purpose and doing the things that He wants you to do? Something we need to pray about too, of Lord, is there anything that you help, that you need to help me remove in my life. Because with goals, there's things that we want to do. For instance, you want to go exercise X amount of time every week, and then there's things you need to take away as well. But sometimes it comes down to a matter of how we spend our time and what takes our time. Is there anything that God would want us to remove, to take off before we go to the race, before we go back to the race of 2025? Any hindrances from living God's way and doing what he wants us to do? But saying everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. An examination of conscience, like we do with communion. Is there any sin in my life that needs to be dealt with before we start the race of 2025? Anything I need to do differently? Anything I need to give up? Anything I need to do better? Get rid of those obstacles. It says, let us run the race with perseverance. The race that they're talking about, the race that we see again and again in the Bible, isn't a short race, isn't a sprint. It's a long distance race. One thing, my kids got into it too. Some of the races that we would go to, sometimes they would have kids races. So we would bring the kids, and one thing that, if you're teaching kids to run, one thing they don't know how to do is pace themselves. It's kind of fun to watch. You watch the kids starting line, they all go full sprint. And they make it usually about a quarter mile, and then they start to walk. It takes some experience and some maturity in running to learn how to pace yourself. Now, it's not easy to teach. Like Cameron's a runner. He's done both cross country and track. And you see that with the middle schoolers. I mean, they take off. The younger ones, the new ones, they all take off full speed and then peter out pretty quickly if they have a couple of miles to go. But you have to learn to pace yourself. One way that a track coach I know teaches it is, you time yourself and you run 1 mile out and 1 mile back, and your second mile needs to be just as fast as your first mile. And that's hard for them to do. One thing when it says, let us run the race with perseverance, that talking about a long race, spiritually speaking. But in a race, sometimes when I see somebody pass me, I delude myself saying, well, they're just not going as far as me. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes not so much. Part of it always bugs me, though, when I see somebody that's a lot older than me just smoke me and go by me. And I don't know how it works. There's always the people that are way older and way heavier that sometimes just finish before. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. So in this life, the spiritual life takes a lot of perseverance. Takes a lot of removing our obstacles and hindrances. Takes a lot of looking at it and removing our sin continuously. It's something that we need to do every year. More often than every year. Persevere. Make sure that we're on track spiritually. Verse 2, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Sometimes translated as the author and perfecter of our faith. The creator of our faith and the one who sees it to completion. Pioneer's there a good word, the one that started it all, the one that goes first. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. We have to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus the whole race. We're in a running race, you're always thinking about the finish line, pacing yourself for that, keeping your eyes fixed on the goal, which determines how fast you go. You go out a whole lot faster for a 5K than you do for a half marathon, or for a sprint versus a long run. But it's saying keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, which is something that we have to do as a believer. One of my favorite hymns, perhaps my favorite, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. We have to always be keeping our eyes upon Jesus. And I love the words, when your eyes are fixed upon Jesus, when you turn your eyes upon Jesus, the things of earth will grow strangely dim. Meaning when our eyes are fixed on Jesus, all those other things, the distractions, all the things the world has to offer, becomes dimmer and dimmer. And that means just less and less important to you. The distractions become less when we keep our eyes fixed upon Jesus. And then it says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. There's reminding us to consider that we don't grow weary and lose heart. Verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you have not resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastens everyone he accepts as a son. This is quoting Proverbs 3, 11 and 12. It says, endure, verse 7, endure hardships as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? And if you were not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for us. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So it's saying that in our struggles against sin and in our troubles in this life, that we're to look at hardships that we face as discipline. Now, discipline is not always punishment. Sometimes there are discipline of things that we have to do in order to make us a better person. And sometimes it is punishment for things that areas where we need to learn to do better. Now, it's using the analogy of parents disciplining us. Now, all of us that were loved by our parents, they made us do things at times that we didn't necessarily want us to do in order to teach us good habits or good discipline, and in order to make us better people. I think we all know kids that are never told no. And we know what happens when children are never told no or never given any structure or discipline. Well, they're little brats, quite frankly. But it's saying that if children are loved, and true children, legitimate children, that they're given some sort of discipline. They're not, good parent doesn't just allow you to eat whatever you want. Ice cream for dinner every night, a diet of cookies and candy and soda. No, and sometimes it falls through the cracks. I don't know why. I've met people that, feed their 6-month-old Coca-Cola in the baby bottle. And I've said, why? Why in the world would you do that? But it's saying that, yeah, I think all of us could look back and see rules that our parents had that we didn't like at the time, and we could see the benefit. And some of us have repeated a lot of that for our children, giving them discipline. But it says endure hardships as discipline. Why? Because they help to make us holy, and they're never pleasant at the time. But second in this chapter, I believe it's telling us to, and we're about to get into it more, to make holiness a priority. We have to think about holiness as we approach 2025 with our goals. What spiritual goals do we have? What do we have in place to make us holier or closer to God? Well, there might be hardships that bring us closer to God, but what about other things? It's great to have Bible reading and prayer time and serving type of goals, as well as other type. But here it's talking about discipline. Verse 11, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Verse 13 there is quoting Proverbs 4:26. And then make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy, for without holiness no one will see God. And we remember the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, right? For they will be filled and they will see God. So, with that, it's writing about holiness. Make every effort to live in peace with everyone. Try to get along with everybody. And to be holy. For without holiness, no one will see God. So we need to get rid of the obstacles. Second, we need to make holiness a priority. And I think we have to be careful with these verses as believers with one another about discipline. Endure hardship as discipline. There are these and some other verses seems to be saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Proverbial wisdom, most of the time, yes, but it's hard when you're going through it. When you're going through something terrible, it's not always helpful to, there's an art of bringing out the right verse at the right time. If somebody's gone through some sort of horrible loss or tragedy, well, endure hardship as discipline. Or James, rejoice when you fall into various trials. Easier said than done, but we need to do it. I read one article recently that seemed to pop up at just the right time. The article was called "When My Husband Died Suddenly, One of His Family Members Said 5 Words That Taunted Me for Years." It said, not long after my husband Keith died suddenly in April 2000, I overheard one of his family members tell someone that she didn't feel sorry for me and my young children. "This will make them stronger," she asserted. 17 years later, her words taunted me as I shuffled across the sizzling parking lot of a suburban shopping center on my way to a therapist's office. Stronger? What a joke. I could barely walk. Once inside, I slumped into an oversized chair and wearily told my new therapist, Elizabeth, my problem was that I sucked at life and that the visit would be a waste of time for both of us. The only reason I was there is because one of my adult daughters had threatened to call 911 if I didn't get help for myself. She'd become alarmed after she couldn't reach me and had stopped by the house, where she discovered me flat on my back on my sofa. I hadn't bathed or changed my clothes in weeks. Assuming Elizabeth would show me the door so she could move on to a more worthwhile patient, I was surprised when instead she asked me to elaborate. And after listening for nearly an hour, she said, "What you're suffering from has nothing to do with being bad at life. It's called resilience fatigue." And it just went on to explain how she overcame a lot of this in her life, she had 3 kids and one on the way when her husband died, and had to adapt, and things got very, very complicated. And the reality, saying, well, it's going to make you stronger in the moment, that's not very helpful. But you could see looking back years later, that in fact sometimes it does bring you closer to God and bring you holier. There are so many people out there that A, found God in the first place when they're in the middle of a tragedy and not knowing what to do, or B, found their way back to God when they're in a tragedy and life's falling apart. Because it makes total sense. That's when you go looking for answers. That's when you start asking some of the hard questions of why? Why did this happen to me? Or why, God? And these things can either contribute to your holiness of bringing you closer to God, or they can push you further away. But it's explaining that a lot of these hard things do in fact make you learn to rely on God more, make you holier, add a depth to you that those who have yet to go through hard things in life simply don't have. It brings a sort of maturity. Let's look at verse 15. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Talking about hardship, as I was saying, it can bring you closer to God, make you holier and refine you, or it can make bitter roots grow up, make you bitter. You could get bitter, or you could get holy. Your choice. And one thing too, with looking at goals and resolutions and the planning of our lives, these verses remind me that God's a lot more interested in your holiness than he is your happiness. It's worth saying again, God's more interested in your holiness than he is in your happiness. And we see this throughout the Bible. God has a bigger plan at work. A few good examples. Joseph. Joseph went through some hard things. His brothers wanted to kill him, but decided instead, being talked into by the oldest brother, to throwing him in a pit and selling him to Ishmaelite traders to be sold as a slave. So he goes from a happy home where he's the favorite child to being sold to Ishmaelite traders on a caravan. I'll bet that wasn't a pleasant journey, being taken away from home. And then he's sold as a slave. Well, that seems to be a sort of low point to rock bottom, but the story gets worse. Potiphar's wife gives a false accusation against him, and he goes from being a slave to being put in the dungeon, put in prison. So things go from bad to worse. But through it all, God uses it to put him in touch with Pharaoh, make him the second most powerful man in Egypt, and save his family, who would have starved to death otherwise. And by saving his family, saving the whole future nation of Israel from extinction. There was something a lot larger at stake. And with our lives, as we plan our year too, we have to see that there's a whole lot more at stake than our own whims, our own happiness, our own goals to make us more comfortable, happier, better people. Now, we don't always see God's big picture. We have as well the theology of Job, being a righteous man who went through some intense suffering. And his friends, at least they showed up and sat with him. That's the main thing, but then they had some bad advice for him, saying that, well, you must have done something to deserve it. Well, we can be just as unhelpful when we bring out these verses at the wrong times. Sometimes can cause some resentment between them and God if it's not given at a timely time. If they would have been better friends if they had sat with him and kept their mouths shut for a little while. Unless Job wanted to talk about such things. So we have Job, we have Joseph, we have so many of the people here that played a bigger purpose in God's plan. And Hebrews chapter 11 that we went through, such a great cloud of witnesses. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, it talks about a lot of them and the suffering that they went through, playing a bigger part in God's plan. Now, would you rather play a big part in God's plan? A big part in his redemptive history? Have a big role in doing the Lord's work? Or live a fat, comfortable, happy, carefree life? Well, it's a choice. It's saying that God hard things and suffering, and here it is addressing suffering. That's a hard question. Very hard question. Now, God, a lot of suffering comes from sin in the world, a fallen world and free will. God gives us choices. If we didn't have free will, we could not really be free to love God. And God wanted people who love him freely. People who don't, in order to really love God, we have to have the choice to not love God and to disobey God. The book we've been using in Sunday school, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, had a good quote this week in our chapter. It said, "The world is fallen, corrupted by sin, under the domination of Satan, and that many things happen in life that are not as God wishes them to be." Now, that doesn't mean God's not sovereign. God can be sovereign and allow free will. He allows us to hurt him and offend him as well as hurt one another. And saying that, well, God doesn't cause many tragedies to happen, he can redeem them, and he can use them in order to sanctify us and bring some good out of even the worst sets of circumstances. Verse 15, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See to it that no one is sexually immoral, or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Remember, he came back from hunting and was famished, and told his brother, if you give me a bowl of stew, I'll give you all the firstborn rights. And later came to regret it. Sold his birthright for a meal. Now, as believers, sometimes people sell their birthright as children of God for just some temporary pleasure. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. Even though he sought the blessing with tears, he could not change what he had done. If you have not come to a mountain, you have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to a trumpet blast, or to such a voice speaking words that those who heard it begged that no further word could be spoken to them, because they could not bear what was commanded. Even as an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. Now this is talking about Mount Sinai. Moses went up the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments from God. And people were afraid of it, and people were instructed that they're to not get too close to the mountain. They're not to touch it. If them or an animal touches it, they will die. Because the fullness of the presence of God was right there. And as Moses went up, God's glory passed before him. And as he went down, he was glowing. The people were terrified because his face was glowing, and they asked him that he would cover his face so that they would not be afraid. I always think of that with the benediction. May the Lord make his face shine upon you. Yeah, that's the only thing. So Moses had to be the go-between between God and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. So the sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. And just the glory of the Lord that was on him. I don't know exactly how that worked, if it was some sort of radiation, and he comes down glowing and all the people are terrified of it. It's talking about Mount Sinai here. Then it says, but you have come to Mount Zion. Mount Zion, the mountain of God. Not Mount Sinai, where we have to keep our distance. Hebrews told us earlier that because of Jesus being our high priest, we can boldly approach the throne of grace. And I have that image when I pray, that you could go in, I see it as like you teleport and you're there before God in the throne room. It's like when you pray, beam me up, Scotty. And you're there in the throne room and God's on the throne. And that you don't have to go hide from his presence, but it says we can boldly approach the throne of grace because of what Jesus did for us, because of his death, sacrifice, and resurrection. It says, but you've come to Mount Zion. Mount Zion, well, it's referred to a few different ways, and it's understood a few different ways. Mount Zion, it's typically referred to as the mountain right outside the gates of Jerusalem. The hill there Sometimes Jerusalem is referred to as Mount Zion. Sometimes the temple itself is referred to as Mount Zion, right where the Temple Mount is. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. Wow, imagine that. The heavenly Jerusalem, thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. To the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, the spirits of the righteous, made perfect. To Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth. But now he has promised, once more, I will shake not only the earth, but the heavens. The word once more indicates the removing of what can be shaken, that is, the created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. So it's saying you don't need to go to Mount Sinai where you can't touch the mountain, where you can't go up, where you have to keep your distance. No, it's saying that you come now to the heavenly kingdom. You come now to Mount Zion. You boldly approach that throne of grace. God's making you holy, and God has made you holy and declared you righteous. When the blood of Jesus covers your sin, when you've accepted him as Lord and Savior. And we progress in that sanctification from wicked to holy. And here he's saying, all the created things ultimately are removed, so that which cannot be shaken may remain. What are those things that cannot be shaken? I like the navigators, the college ministry, the navigators, saying there are two things that are eternal: the word of God and the souls of men. Two things that are eternal, the word of God and the souls of men. So it's saying focus on that which is eternal, not worldly and temporary things. And it's good to be reminded of that as we face a new year. Focusing on the word of God and the souls of men are really what we have that cannot be shaken. Therefore, since we're receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, that sounds great, doesn't it? The unshakable kingdom. The unshakable kingdom that we're approaching. Let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire. And that's quoting Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 24. God is a consuming fire, ultimately burning everything up that's not eternal, that's not going to remain. So, as we look back at 2024 and look forward to 2025, think about what we're doing with our lives. Not that we can control everything, but it's in God's hand. But for what we can have control over, that we think about those things which are eternal, and we think about God's sanctifying work in our lives, and that we could look back at some of the hard things, and a lot of them we're not going to understand why on this side of heaven. A lot of it's going to be the other side where it even begins to make some sense. But we can trust God's process and that he knows what we're doing. And some of those things that are a result of sin, we could trust him that he's going to use it somehow for our holiness and for his glory. Amen. Happy New Year. Let's have a closing song. We're going to have a closing song. And if you'd like to come forward for prayer for anything at this time, I'll be up here happy to pray with anybody.